Over 4 decades ago, in the quiet industrial belt of Port Huron in Michigan, a young woman stepped out into the cold night air for what should have been an ordinary celebration and never came home again. She was 21-year-old Karen Marie Humphrey, a devoted daughter and hardworking secretary, who vanished after leaving a lively bachelor and bachelorette party with her friends. By morning, her pale green Buick Century sat abandoned on a side street, only a few blocks from where she was last seen, locked, silent, and empty, while her mother sat awake in a small house miles away, feeling a growing terror that something was terribly wrong. Within weeks, a local family man was arrested, questioned, and convicted of her kidnapping and murder, and the town tried to believe that justice had been done. But he was innocent. Years passed, seasons turned, and the file, with Karen's name on it, grew dusty in the basement of the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office. The real killer moved through life unseen. Then, decades later, when an investigator reopened the long, cold case, a single, overlooked detail in an old photograph and a sliver of preserved biological evidence would drag the past into the present. A pair of heavy boot prints. A dark pickup truck missing its rear bumper. A secret affair that destroyed one man's life. A name hidden in a family Bible. And finally, a strand of DNA that traveled through time and family. Trees to point to the man who had escaped justice. For almost 44 years, how did an innocent man end up in prison for a murder he did not commit, while the real killer walked free in the same community for decades? And what hidden clues buried in an old Polaroid photograph and in a fragile piece of evidence from 1980 finally exposed the true face of the man who took Karen's life. If you want to uncover the answers to these questions and follow this cold case from the first frantic phone call to the final verdict, then like this video right now and subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and make sure you turn on the bell icon so you do not miss our upcoming episodes. Tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story, and let us complete 5,000 likes on this episode so that more people can see how justice can arrive even after a lifetime. Story begins in November of 1980 in the small, quiet community of Smiths Creek, just outside Port Huron, where winter always seemed to arrive early. The last color of autumn had already drained from the trees, leaving their branches bare and black against a low gray sky. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp leaves, and distant river water. In a modest, busy home on Cedar Street lived the Humphrey family, a household that knew grief and struggle, but still held warmth inside its walls. 21-year-old Karen Marie Humphrey moved through that house with the easy rhythm of someone used to helping more than she complained. She lived there with her mother Sylvia and 6 of her 7 siblings. Her father Thomas had died when she was only 10 years old, and from that moment on, Sylvia had become the center of the family, a woman who pushed through her own sorrow in order to raise 8 children with discipline, love, and a determination that none of them would lose their way. Karen was the kind of daughter who made that effort feel worthwhile. Since finishing high school, Karen had worked as a secretary at Marysville Marine Distributors in nearby Marysville. Her days were filled with typed invoices, phone calls, and neat stacks of paperwork. She was known at the office for calm efficiency and a gentle smile that made even impatient customers soften. Her supervisor, Arthur Jenkins, often described her as a steady presence. The sort of young woman who showed up on time, did her work, and always talked about her family when others complained about theirs. For Karen, her life may have seemed simple from the outside, but it was full of quiet purpose. That Saturday, the 1st of November, had been busy but ordinary. The air outside was crisp, the kind of cold that slipped under sleeves and around collars. Karen moved through errands during the day. One of the most important was a stop at George's auto shop. She had a special affection for her car, a pale green 1973 Buick Century that felt like independence on 4 wheels. George Barnes, the shop owner, had promised to fit new rims for her. As she watched the work being done, she imagined how the car would look under the streetlights that night. When George waved her off and told her that the Buick would look like a dream, she laughed lightly, then drove home along familiar roads, not knowing it would be one of the last simple pleasures of her life. Back at the house, the evening settled in early. The television murmured in the background, and the smell of dinner still lingered in the kitchen. Sylvia sat with a sweater in her lap, carefully mending worn stitches, a habit formed during years. When money had been tight and nothing could be wasted, Lisa, one of Karen's younger sisters, dried dishes at the sink. While the rest of the family moved through their own routines in the small but lively home, the world outside might have felt bleak and cold, but inside, there was the comfortable noise of family. Karen was getting ready for a night that was meant to be joyful. Friends of hers, Richie Jensen and Kathy Miller, were about to be married, and a combined bachelor and a bachelorette party had been planned at a rented house on McBrady Street in Port Huron. It was the kind of event everyone in their circle looked forward to. Music, food, laughter, and the feeling that life was moving forward with weddings and futures and plans. Karen chose her clothes with casual care, making sure she looked presentable, but still like herself. She buttoned her denim jacket against the creeping cold, then stepped out into the hallway. In the kitchen, she gave Lisa a quick hug, the clink of dishes pausing for a moment as sisters held on to each other in a small, everyday gesture that would later feel painfully important. From the living room, Sylvia looked up from her sewing and watched her daughter head for the door. There was a familiar worry in her eyes, the worry that never leaves a mother once her children begin to step out into the world. "Alone, do not be out too late, honey," Sylvia called. After her voice soft but firm, a phrase she had used so many times that it almost felt like part of the family's nightly ritual. Karen smiled and promised she would not stay. Outlong then stepped into the cold evening and closed the door behind her. She walked to her Buick, the new rims catching a faint gleam from the streetlight, and slid behind the wheel. The engine turned over, the sound low and steady. For a moment she sat there in the quiet street, the breath from her lungs fogging in front of her face, the night ahead full of nothing more dangerous than music and friends. Then she pulled away from the curb and drove off towards Port Huron, towards the house on McBrady Street, and towards a night that would begin with celebration and end with a silence that would haunt an entire county for decades to come. The cold breath of November moved across Port Huron and Smiths Creek, like a quiet warning as the night deepened. The sky above the St. Clair River stayed heavy and low, carrying the weight of winter even before it fully arrived. Streets were lined with bare trees that reached upward like dark silhouettes, and the smell of damp soil and wood smoke drifted through the air. It was the kind of atmosphere where sound traveled far and silence lingered longer than usual, giving every night a feeling of mystery and stillness. Smiths Creek, a small, peaceful community, seemed even quieter than usual in those early days of November 1980. Families stayed indoors. Furnaces hummed, and the world outside felt both calm and slightly uneasy, as if holding its breath. Inside one of the modest homes on Cedar Street lived the Humphrey family, a large and hard-working household that had learned to stand strong even through loss. 21-year-old Karen Marie Humphrey was one of the bright spirits of that home. She carried herself with a soft calmness that made others feel at ease, and she had a warm smile that people remembered long after she left a room. Her father, Thomas, had passed away when she was only 10 years old, leaving her mother, Sylvia, to raise 8 children on her own. But Sylvia had done it with determination and love. Shaping a family that supported one another in every way they could, Karen grew up as someone who helped without being asked. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, picking up chores, checking on younger siblings, and offering comfort whenever her mother's tired eyes gave away the strain she carried. That bond between mother and daughter was deeply woven. Karen often sat with Sylvia in the evenings, listening to stories, sharing small moments, or simply keeping her company while the family buzzed around them. The love in their home did not erase the difficulty they faced, but it gave them strength to face it together. After graduating high school, Karen found work as a secretary at Marysville Marine Distributors. She handled the phones, organized paperwork, typed letters, and managed customer orders with a level of patience that surprised even her coworkers. Her supervisor, Arthur Jenkins, often relied on her more than anyone else, because she worked with a sense of calm even during busy days. To her coworkers, she was the young woman who cared deeply about her family, who never raised her voice, and who always tried to help. For Karen, the job was not glamorous, but it made her proud. It allowed her to support the household and take small steps toward independence. The day of November 1st had started like any other. The cold air outside made her wrap her jacket tighter as she moved through her errands. One of the most important stops was at George's auto shop, a small garage filled with the scent of oil and the sound of tools striking metal. She had arranged 4 new rims to be fitted on her favorite car, a pale green 1973 Buick Century that she cared for as if it were a friend. George Barnes, the friendly shop owner, had promised that the new rims would give the Buick a fresh look. Karen watched the work with quiet excitement, then drove away feeling that small spark of joy that came from taking care of something she loved. When she returned home, the evening was settling in early, filling the windows with a dim gray light. Her brothers and sisters moved around the house finishing chores while Sylvia sat in the living room with a sweater in her lap, pairing loose stitches with careful hands. There was safety in that routine, the familiar sounds of family life echoing softly through the small home. Karen stepped inside, brushed off the cold, and began preparing for the night ahead. She carefully chose her clothes, freshened up, and buttoned her denim jacket as the last breeze of daylight faded into darkness. That night she planned to attend a combined bachelor and bachelorette party for her friends, Richie Jensen and Kathy Miller. The celebration was being held at a rented house on McBrady Street in Port Huron, and it was one of the events everyone had been looking forward to. Friends from high school were expected. There would be music, laughter, fun, and a feeling of excitement as the couple prepared for their upcoming wedding. It was the kind of night that promised memories, not danger. Before leaving, she hugged her younger sister Lisa, who paused from drying dishes just long enough to smile back at her. In the living room, Sylvia looked up and watched her daughter preparing to leave. A mother's worry lived quietly in her eyes, the same worry she felt every time one of her children stepped out into the night. She softly told Karen to come home early. Karen promised she would. She walked out to her Buick, the new rims catching the faint glow of the streetlight, and sat behind the wheel for a moment. Her breath fogged in the cold air, the engine rumbled to life, and she drove away into the night, unaware that she was traveling into the final hours of her life. Something unexpected waited for her beyond that party. Hidden in the cold shadows of Port Huron, waiting for the moment her path crossed with danger. The drive from Smith's Creek into Port Huron felt quiet and steady as Karen followed the familiar roads. Streetlights stretched across the pavement like dim glowing markers leading her toward the rented house on McBrady Street where the celebration was already underway. As she approached the neighborhood, she could hear faint music drifting through the cold air long before she reached the house. Laughter rose and fell from behind the windows, and the warm yellow glow spilling onto the porch made the place look alive against the dark November night. Inside, the atmosphere was loud and cheerful. The house felt crowded, filled with friends talking over music, sharing stories, celebrating the upcoming wedding of Richie Jensen and Kathy Miller. The scent of cheap beer and cigarette smoke mixed with the sweetness of snacks laid out across the table. Someone had turned the volume of the stereo a little too high, and popular songs of the early 80s echoed through the rooms while people danced, shouted greetings, and moved from one conversation to another. It was the kind of party where time slipped by icily. When Karen entered, several friends called out her name and waved her toward them. She smiled with the soft warmth she was known for and made her way through the crowd. She spent a while catching up with classmates like Jessica Larson, who hugged her tightly before pulling her into a small group of friends. Brian Kelly cracked jokes that made everyone laugh, kind of laughter that drifted into the air and dissolved into the noise of the party. Karen moved from one conversation to another, enjoying the company of people she had known for years. She seemed relaxed, comfortable, and unaware that the hours ahead held danger she could not imagine. Around midnight, the energy of the party shifted slightly when the front door swung open and her boyfriend, Frederick Hill, stepped inside. He was older than her by a few years, with a brooding expression that often drew attention before he even spoke. When he entered, a few faces turned quickly, some out of curiosity and some out of discomfort. Frederick had a temper that rose faster than most people wished to deal with, and even during cheerful gatherings. His moods could shift without warning. He found Karen among her friends and walked toward her. She greeted him with a soft smile and tried to fold him into the moment, but the tension in his shoulders hinted that he had not come in a calm state. For a while he stood beside her quietly, but each small thing seemed to irritate him. A comment from someone, the music being too loud, Karen speaking to another friend for too long. His jaw tightened and his eyes darkened, the familiar signs that he was slipping into one of his moods. Karen sensed it as well. The way a person becomes trained to notice the earliest signs of someone's anger. She tried to keep things relaxed, tried to stay close to him, tried to balance enjoying the party with managing the rising storm in his expression. But as the night grew later, his frustration grew heavier. A few people noticed the tension between them and slowly moved away, giving them space while pretending not to stare. Sometime past midnight, when the music had settled into a steady thump and people were beginning to wind down, Frederick leaned in and told Karen sharply that he wanted to leave. His tone carried no room for argument. Karen, not wanting a scene, agreed and followed him out of the house, into the cold darkness outside. The air hit her face like a sudden reminder that the world outside the party was far quieter and far more serious. They reached her pale green Buick Century parked along Varney Street. As soon as the doors closed behind them and the car became a small, quiet space, the argument took shape. Their voices filled the car, tense and tight. Harsh words rose and fell, each one heavier than the last. The bitterness in Frederick's tone clashed against Karen's attempt to calm him, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to keep things from getting worse. But anger does not always listen, and in that moment it certainly did not. Finally, Frederick snapped, pushed open the passenger door, and stepped out into the cold night. He slammed the door behind him and began walking down 10th Street with long, furious steps. His figure moved deeper into the darkness. Shoulders rigid and fists clenched, Karen sat there for a heartbeat, breathing hard, the pain of the moment sinking into her chest. Then she opened the door and hurried after him, calling out softly into the cold air. Her voice carried down the empty street, her breath visible in the dim light. She tried to catch up, to ask him to stop, to make him listen. But Frederick refused to turn back. He kept walking, ignoring her voice, as it echoed between the quiet houses. After a few moments, Karen stood still, defeated by the heavy silence he left behind. Her shoulders lowered as the cold settled around her. Slowly she turned back, walking toward her Buick with her steps heavy and her heart aching. She slipped inside the driver's seat again and closed the door gently. The streetlight above flickered. The engine stayed silent. The night around her was empty. She did not know that the moment she sat alone in that car, her life was already moving toward a path filled with danger, fear, in a darkness that had been waiting in the pre-dawn hours. Something unseen was watching the quiet streets of Port Huron that night, and Karen had just stepped into its shadow. The night grew colder as the hours slipped quietly past midnight. In the small home on Cedar Street, the Humphrey household was resting under the soft hum of the furnace. The world outside was silent, but inside the living room, Sylvia slept lightly on the sofa, the half-mended sweater slipping from her lap. A sudden, uneasy feeling stirred her awake, the kind of feeling that rises in a mother's heart without reason, yet refuses to be ignored. She blinked into the dim room, listening to the quiet house, feeling something wrong pressing gently but firmly against her thoughts. She sat up slowly, rubbing her hands together for warmth, and glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just after 3 in the morning. The house felt too still. A mother knows the rhythm of her children, the ordinary patterns of their comings and goings, and in that moment the silence carried a weight that made her chest tighten. She stood and walked quietly through the hallway toward Karen's room, her footsteps soft on the worn carpet. When she pushed open the bedroom door, her heart sank. The bed was neatly made, the blanket untouched, the room exactly as it had been when Karen left the house the previous evening. Sylvia whispered her daughter's name into the quiet, hopeful that she might hear a response, a movement, anything. But the room stayed still, holding only the faint smell of Karen's perfume and the cold air drifting from the window pane. Fear rising in her throat, Sylvia reached for the phone and dialed Frederick Hill's number. The phone rang and rang, each unanswered ring sinking deeper into her chest. She waited. Tried again. No response. She did not know what happened after they left the party, only that something inside her refused to believe that everything was fine. The minutes dragged painfully. Her hands trembled with every passing moment. By 4:30, the fear had become unbearable. Sylvia picked up the phone once more, this time dialing the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office. When dispatcher Brenda Whitman answered, Sylvia's voice was trembling with dread as she explained that her daughter Karen had not come home and that she felt something terrible had happened. The call was logged at 4:37 in the morning. Marking the beginning of a search that would change the entire community, the sun struggled to break through the cold. Gray sky later that day, casting a weak light over a world that felt tense and unsettled. Around noon to hunters, Walter Schmidt and Robert Thompson were walking through the dense pine trees of the Beards Hill State Game Area. The air smelled of damp earth and old needles, and the ground was soft from the overnight frost. They moved slowly, watching the undergrowth with practiced eyes, when something unusual caught their attention. There, in a thicket of slender dark pines, a still form lay partially hidden. A young woman fully clothed in a denim jacket, pale, motionless. The hunters froze in shock, then stepped back quickly, their hearts pounding as they hurried toward their truck to call authorities. Minutes later, the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office received the report. Sheriff Wallace Ford and Sergeant Dale Patterson immediately headed to the scene, their expressions heavy with the dread they had learned too well in their years of service. The path through the woods was narrow and cold, and the deeper they went, the heavier the silence became. When they reached the body, they stood still for a long moment. It was Karen, the missing young woman whose mother had called in fear only hours earlier. Dr. Lydia Crane, the county medical examiner, conducted an immediate preliminary examination. The truth was devastating. Karen had been sexually assaulted and shot twice in the head. Her life had been taken with a coldness that tightened the air around the investigators. Sheriff Ford and Sergeant Patterson began directing their team. Photographs were taken. The perimeter was marked. Footprints were documented where the damp soil held clear impressions. But the scene told a quiet story of someone who had acted quickly and left little behind. With the technology available in 1980, evidence had to be gathered by hand, with only simple tools and careful eyes. Soil samples, a few faint fibers, and partial footprints were collected, but they offered little promise. No weapon was found. No clear trail pointed to the killer. The cold wind moved through the pine trees as the team worked, carrying the scent of earth and sorrow. By late afternoon, the body was removed with careful respect, leaving behind a crime scene that felt hollow and silent. Sheriff Ford looked over the area one last time before turning back along the narrow path. The case had just begun, but already the darkness surrounding Karen's final moments felt deep and difficult to pierce. Somewhere out there, a person had taken her life and vanished into the night without leaving a name or a face behind. And the first faint pieces of the investigation were about to lead toward someone who had nothing to do with the true crime. The hours following the discovery of Karen's body were filled with a heavy sense of urgency. The St. Clair County Sheriff's Office moved quickly, trying to gather every small piece of information before the trail went cold. The first step was to return to the people who had seen Karen alive only hours before her death. The house on McBrady Street, once filled with music and laughter, now felt different when officers stepped inside to question the guests. Voices that had been loud and cheerful the night before were now low and uneasy as officers began asking questions one by one. Friends who remembered Karen smiling and moving easily through the party now struggled to recall the exact details of her departure. Some insisted she left shortly after midnight, saying they remembered the front door closing behind her while the stereo still played loudly. Others were certain she had stayed until nearly 2 in the morning, pointing to moments they believed happened after midnight. Moments they connected with Karen still being present. The conflicting times created a fog over the timeline. making it difficult for investigators to clearly understand when she had actually walked out the door with Frederick. When Frederick Hill was brought in for questioning, he arrived looking exhausted, shaken, and unsteady. His eyes were red. His voice trembled as he explained the argument that took place inside the Buick. He described how anger overwhelmed him, how he had stepped out of the car, slammed the door, and walked away down the dark street of Port Huron. He insisted that he had gone straight home afterward. Admitting he had no one to confirm his story, his alibi rested only on his own words, and the silence of his empty home offered no support. The emotional nature of his interview made the officers watch him carefully. His guilt over the argument was clear, his regret raw, but nothing in his story directly connected him to Karen's murder. Still, without a confirmed timeline or witnesses, his unverified alibi left a shadow of suspicion that lingered as investigators continued their work. Then came the call that shifted the direction of the investigation. Dispatcher Brenda Whitman reviewed the overnight logs and spotted a report from a woman named Evelyn Albright. She had called earlier that same morning, unaware of Karen's disappearance at the time. Evelyn explained that she had seen a disturbing scene near 10th and Water Streets. In the cold pre-dawn hours, she witnessed a man forcing a young woman into a dark-colored pickup truck at gunpoint. The truck was old, possibly from the mid-60s. And what caught her attention most was that it was missing its rear bumper. Her voice in the recorded call carried fear and urgency. She described the truck as dark, either black or dark blue, and insisted that what she witnessed was not a simple argument or misunderstanding. The woman had been forced inside. That detail struck investigators hard. This new information added a frightening layer to the timeline and pointed toward the possibility that Karen had been taken. From the street shortly after Frederick walked away, the description of the truck quickly became the most important clue in the early hours of the investigation. Officers sent out alerts across the region, scanning records and searching roads for any dark Chevrolet pickup from the mid-60s missing a bumper. It was a narrow description, but it was also the only solid lead they had. While this search unfolded, officers located Karen's pale green Buick Century. It was parked 4 blocks from the party house, locked and untouched. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no shattered glass, no blood. The car sat silently under a streetlight, holding no answers about what had happened after she returned to it alone. The stillness of the Buick added pain to the mystery. It was the last place she had sat waiting for a moment of calm after the argument. Now it stood as a silent witness to her final minutes of safety before tragedy found her. Investigators now had conflicting timelines, an unverified alibi, and a chilling eyewitness account of an abduction. And somewhere in the night, a dark pickup had vanished with the truth hidden inside its cab. The search for the dark pickup truck became the heartbeat of the investigation. Officers combed through gas stations, diners, and late-night businesses along the roads surrounding Port Huron, hoping someone had seen a vehicle that matched Evelyn Albright's chilling description. Days passed with no solid progress. Then a small but powerful detail surfaced at a rundown station called Johnson's Gas and Go. The night attendant, a young man named Ronald Delaney, remembered something that stopped investigators in their tracks. Ronald explained that in the early hours of November 2nd, somewhere around 2:45 or 3 in the morning, an old reddish-brown Ford pickup had pulled into the station. He remembered it clearly because the truck was missing its rear bumper, and because the man driving it looked worn out, almost as if he had come from a long shift. The detail of the missing bumper made the officers listen closely. The eyewitness at 10th and Water Streets had seen a dark truck with the same missing bumper. Ronald insisted the one he saw was a Ford, not a Chevrolet, but the timing, the direction the truck traveled, and the condition of the vehicle were too close to ignore. When asked if he recognized the driver, Ronald did not hesitate. He knew the man. His name was Calvin Hayes, a local mill worker who often passed through the area during night shifts. It was the first concrete name investigators had connected to a suspicious vehicle. That single detail placed Calvin within miles of the place where Karen's body had been found and within the same time frame. She had gone missing, Officers moved quickly to speak with him. When they arrived at his modest ranch-style home on the outskirts of Port Huron, Calvin answered the door, looking tired but cooperative. He was a powerful-looking man with calloused hands, the kind of hands shaped by long hours of labor. His wife and 2 young children were inside. Unaware of the shadow now forming around their family, Calvin admitted he had been out that night. He explained that he had finished his shift around 2 in the morning and had gone raccoon hunting in the Beards Hills game area. He said he had traps set from earlier in the week, and he wanted to check them before heading home. He confirmed that he drove a reddish-brown 1969 Ford F-100. And yes, the rear bumper had rusted off about a year ago. The truck matched Ronald's memory exactly. When asked about his footwear, Calvin brought out a pair of heavy work boots, the soles thick with dried mud. Investigators knelt down to examine them, their eyes narrowing when they recognized the pattern of the tread. The thick horizontal lines and rounded toe shape looked strikingly similar to the prints photographed around Karen's body. It was not undeniable proof, but it was enough to tighten the feeling of suspicion around him. Throughout the questioning, Calvin tried to stay calm, answering every question he could, but his hands shook slightly, and his gaze kept drifting away, as if he feared the walls were closing in. His story about hunting felt rehearsed, and when officers pressed him about specific details, he stammered and hesitated. The officers noticed every crack in his composure. "Sheriff." Ford suggested a polygraph test to clear up the confusion and give Calvin a chance to prove his innocence. Calvin resisted at first, worried his wife would not understand why he was being questioned, but after a pause he agreed. The test was administered by a trained examiner. Calvin sat stiffly in the chair, his heart rate rising as each question was asked about his movements, his truck, and his knowledge of Karen's death. When the results came in, the room grew heavy. The examiner reported deception on all key questions. To the investigators, this was the final push that turned suspicion into certainty. Combined with the matching truck description, the consistent footprints, and his shaky explanations, the failed polygraph painted him as the man responsible for the young woman's death. On December 10th of 1980, just weeks after the community had been shaken by the discovery of Karen's body, deputies arrived at the Hayes residence with an arrest warrant. As neighbors peeked from behind curtains, officers led Calvin to the patrol car. He did not protest, only stood there with a stunned expression, as if he could not understand how quickly his life had shifted from routine to accusation. Within hours, he was charged with the murder of Karen Marie Humphrey. Papers were filed, court dates were set, and the community, desperate for answers, believed the case was finally solved. But the truth was far more tangled than anyone could see. The trial of Calvin. Hayes began in early 1981 inside the old St. Clair County Courthouse, a building whose stone walls had witnessed decades of sorrow, justice, and human weakness. On the morning the trial opened, the courtroom filled quickly. Every seat was taken, and the hallways echoed with whispers. People who had never known Karen personally still felt the weight of her loss, and many came hoping to see justice delivered for a young woman whose life had been taken far too soon. The atmosphere trembled with tension and emotion. In the front row sat the Humphrey family. Sylvia wore black, her face pale with months of grief. Lisa sat beside her, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every time the door opened, every time a voice echoed through the room, Sylvia's shoulders tightened. To her, this courtroom was the closest thing to closure she had been offered since the night. Her daughter disappeared when Calvin was escorted inside. He looked nothing like the man who had stood in the doorway of his ranch house only weeks earlier. His shoulders were slumped, his face drawn, and his eyes carried a hollow fear. He stared straight ahead, unable to meet the eyes of the grieving family. The weight of the accusation hung over him like a shadow he could not escape. The prosecution began with a firm, confident tone. They presented the circumstantial evidence as if it formed one solid line pointing toward Calvin. They relied heavily on the eyewitness accounts linking his reddish-brown Ford truck to the early morning hours. They emphasized the boot prints at the crime scene, which appeared similar to the boots found in his home, and they used the failed polygraph as a pillar of doubt, suggesting that an innocent man would not have stumbled under the pressure of such a test. Piece by piece, they built a narrative of a violent act, carried out by a man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, a man who worked late nights, who wandered the woods alone, who had no alibi except his own words. In the eyes of many watching, the story felt convincing. The defense struggled from the beginning. Calvin's court-appointed attorney, Marla Deneen, was young and outmatched by both the prosecution's experience and the crushing pressure from the public. The town wanted answers. The family wanted peace. And her client had already damaged himself by lying about his activities the night Karen died. That lie, born from shame and fear rather than guilt, would become the heaviest burden he carried in the courtroom. Marla argued that polygraph tests were unreliable, that the truck descriptions were inconsistent, and that no physical evidence directly tied Calvin to the murder. But every time she spoke, the courtroom seemed to lean away from her, as if the tide itself resisted her defense. On the third day of the trial, Calvin took the stand. His voice was unsteady as he repeated his claim of raccoon hunting. Then, with the courtroom silent and dozens of eyes fixed on him, he broke down. He admitted that he had lied. Not about the murder, but about the hunting. He confessed that he had been with a married woman that night, and that he had hidden the truth to protect her and to protect his family from humiliation. Gasps rippled across the room. Sylvia covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. For her and many others, this sounded like desperation, not truth. Prosecutor Dominic Vance rose to his feet and attacked the claim mercilessly. He painted Calvin's confession as a last attempt to rescue himself from the noose tightening around his neck. He argued that a man who lied once could lie again, that the story of an affair was nothing more than a desperate invention. Calvin, trembling on the stand, insisted he was telling the truth. His voice cracked as he tried to explain, but the damage was done. The jury saw a man who changed his story and who showed fear during a polygraph. The image of guilt had already formed in their minds. After 3 days of testimony, arguments, and emotional strain, the jury withdrew to deliberate. The wait was short. Less than 2 hours later, they returned. When the foreman stood and read the verdict, the quiet in the courtroom was suffocating. They found Calvin Hayes guilty of first-degree murder. Sylvia wept openly, her body shaking as years of grief and unanswered questions seemed to ease for a moment. For her and her family, the verdict brought a fragile sense of peace. But for Calvin, the world collapsed. Judge Malcolm Sterling delivered the sentence with a steady voice. 40 years to life in the Michigan State Prison. As the gavel struck, sound stretched through the room like a final blow. Calvin was taken away in handcuffs. His face blank, his future erased. His wife Dorothy did not last long under the weight of public shame and rumors. She divorced him within a year. His children, Samuel and Maria, were told that their father was away working. They did not know the truth. Inside the prison walls, Calvin faded into a quiet existence shared with a stranger in a small metal cell. He wrote letters that were never answered. He replayed the night of Karen's murder again and again, wondering how his truth had turned into a cage. And while he tried to survive behind bars, the real killer walked free, unnoticed, unnamed, and living his life only miles away. 3 years passed after the conviction, and life in Port Huron settled into an uneasy rhythm. The community believed the case was closed, and Karen's family tried to accept the painful truth that justice had been served, even if nothing could return their daughter. But in the spring of 1984, a quiet crack formed in the story everyone thought they understood. It arrived in the form of a letter, delivered directly to the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office. The name signed at the bottom was Lorraine Gray. The letter was short, trembling, and filled with weight. Lorraine wrote that she had information that could change everything about the night Karen Humphrey was murdered. She asked to speak to Sheriff Ford privately. The request sounded like a desperate attempt for attention, but something in her words carried the tone of a long-held truth trying to surface. Ford agreed to see her. When Lorraine arrived, she looked terrified but determined. She explained that she had been the woman Calvin had spoken about during his trial. She had indeed been with him on the night of November 1st and into the early hours of November 2nd. They had met secretly in the woods for an affair they both feared would destroy their families. She described the exact location, the time they arrived, the time they left, and the details that only someone truly present could know. She spoke with shame, but also relief, when she offered to take a polygraph to prove her honesty. The test was arranged immediately. The results were clear and unwavering. She passed every question without any sign of deception. Her story aligned perfectly with Calvin's testimony that the court had dismissed as a desperate lie. Now the truth stood bare. The revelation shattered the foundation of the original conviction. Within weeks, the court reviewed the new evidence. Judge Malcolm Sterling returned to the bench, this time not to sentence a man, but to right a terrible wrong. In a solemn hearing, he overturned the conviction and ordered Calvin's immediate release. The news broke through Port Huron like a shockwave. Karen's family sat in stunned silence, struggling to understand how the man they believed responsible was suddenly declared innocent. Grief rose again inside Sylvia, heavier this time because the closure she clung to had dissolved in a single moment. It felt as though she had lost Karen all over again. The community, once sure of the truth, now felt betrayed. How could the investigation have gone so wrong? How could an affair, hidden out of shame, turn into the rope that had tightened around an innocent man's life? The case was officially reopened, but hope for progress quickly faded. Investigators returned to the earliest leads, re-interviewed the same individuals, and re-examined the small pieces of physical evidence. Everything pointed back to the same dead ends. The truck description remained vague. The boot prints matched more than one brand sold across Michigan. And no new witness stepped forward in the growing shadow of uncertainty. Then, in 1994, a strange lead surfaced. A woman named June Arnett found a small slip of paper tucked deep inside her grandmother's old family Bible. The paper held a single handwritten name, Jasper Crowley. Her grandmother had been deeply interested in Karen's case when it happened, but no one knew why that name had been saved or what it meant. Detectives brought in Jasper Crowley, a quiet man with no history of violence. He denied any involvement, agreed to a polygraph, and the results came back inconclusive. His shoe size did not match the prints collected years earlier. No evidence tied him to Karen, and with nothing solid, the lead dissolved into confusion. Investigators suspected June might have misunderstood the significance of the paper, or that her grandmother had simply written down a rumor from the early days of the investigation. After that, the case slowly slipped into darkness. Files were boxed and moved to storage. Officers retired. New sheriffs took office. Memories faded. Karen's file sat untouched in a dusty cabinet deep in the basement of the sheriff's office. The murder of Karen Marie Humphrey became another cold case, buried by time. Yet the truth still waited in silence, hidden within a single piece of evidence that no one yet possessed the technology to unlock. Decades drifted by while Karen's file sat buried in the cold. Archives of the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office. Pages yellowed. Polaroids faded. Names grew faint in memory. What once stirred an entire community had become a silent folder resting beneath layers of dust. But outside those basement walls, the world was changing. Science was changing, and a new kind of investigation was rising, one that did not rely on witnesses or luck, but on hidden patterns inside human DNA. Forensic genealogy began reshaping cold cases across the country. Investigators discovered that a tiny trace of biological evidence could unlock family trees, reveal distant relatives, and lead detectives to the one person whose DNA connected every branch. Cases once considered impossible were being solved after 40, 50, even 60 years. Each breakthrough lit a spark in departments across the nation. And in St. Clair County, that spark reached Sheriff Matt King in early 2022. Sheriff King stood inside the records room, holding Karen's old case file. The weight of decades hung heavy in his hands. He knew the community had long accepted the case as unsolvable. He knew the evidence was limited, fragile, and collected with the technology of 1980. But he also knew that one piece of evidence might still carry the truth: the biological sample taken during Karen's autopsy. A single strand of the killer's DNA preserved for more than 40 years. Sheriff King made a bold decision. He authorized the Michigan State Police to reopen the evidence and submit the biological sample for advanced forensic analysis. A partnership was formed with Outram Incorporated, one of the leading laboratories specializing in degraded and historical DNA. If there was even a trace of genetic material left, they believed they could pull it out of silence. When the sample arrived at the Outram laboratory, it was handled with extreme care. Dr. Miles Corbin, the lead forensic geneticist, oversaw the process himself. Using advanced sequencing methods, his team extracted the DNA from the decades-old semen sample. The work was slow, delicate, and carried out under magnification so intense that a speck of dust could ruin hours of progress. But finally, after weeks of processing, they succeeded. The sample produced a complete forensic-grade genome. It was enough to trace ancestry, enough to build a family tree, enough to lead to a name: Outram's in-house genealogy team, led by Chief Genealogist Carla Davis, began the next phase of the work. They used public genetic databases, ancestral links, marriage records, historical archives, and old census documents to identify relatives connected to the unknown DNA profile. Small, distant genetic matches slowly formed into a pattern, like a massive puzzle fitting together piece by piece. The branches of a family tree began taking shape. After months of analysis, one surname rose repeatedly from the data: Lamming. The DNA belonged to someone closely tied to the Lamming family, a family with long roots in the Port Huron region. The genealogists provided several potential leads to investigators. Among them was an elderly man named Raymond Lamming. He had lived in Port Huron in 1980 and fit certain broad parameters. Detectives decided to start with him. Officers began surveillance. They watched him. They followed him. They waited for an opportunity to collect something he discarded. One afternoon, he left a diner and tossed a coffee cup into a public trash bin. Detectives retrieved it immediately and sent it for testing. Days later, the results returned. Raymond Lamming was not a match. His DNA was completely different from the sample extracted from Karen's case. Yet the genealogical evidence remained certain. The killer belonged somewhere on the same branch of the family. Not Raymond himself, but someone close. Someone related by blood. The search narrowed again, and new names were placed under the microscope. One name began to rise with chilling clarity: Douglas Lamming, born in 1948. Lived in Fort Gratiot, worked odd jobs, had a record for disorderly conduct and public intoxication in his younger years. And most importantly, he had lived in the Port Huron area his entire life. Including during the year Karen was murdered, investigators shifted their focus. They watched him from a distance. They waited for a discarded item. One morning, Douglas carried a trash bag outside and placed it at the curb. When he walked back inside, detectives moved quickly. A water bottle sitting near the top of the bag was collected and rushed to the laboratory. When the results came back, there was no confusion, doubt, no hesitation. The DNA matched the semen found on Karen Humphrey. With overwhelming certainty, the man who had escaped suspicion for 42 years was suddenly standing in the bright light of truth, surrounded by science that could no longer be ignored. And there was still another hidden piece of this story, waiting to surface. A clue that would reveal just how many people were involved on that cold November night. Once the DNA match returned, the entire investigation shifted into a tense and calculated urgency. Detectives knew they had only one chance to approach Douglas Lamming without alerting him. Surveillance on him grew even tighter. Officers watched him from unmarked cars, studied his routines, and followed him through quiet neighborhood streets. They observed the way he moved through his days, how calm he seemed, unaware that the truth he had escaped for 42 years was finally closing in around him. Every movement he made mattered. Investigators needed one last piece of physical confirmation before they could move toward arrest. They waited for something he would discard without thinking. That moment arrived one cold morning when Douglas stepped outside his home in Fort Gratiot. He carried a trash bag to the curb and tucked it inside the bin. As he walked back into the house, detectives approached quickly. They reached into the bin and retrieved a water bottle resting near the top of the bag. It was enough. The bottle was rushed to the laboratory. The test results came back fast and clear. The DNA profile extracted from the bottle matched the DNA taken from Karen's autopsy with near mathematical certainty. The scene investigators had tried to understand for decades suddenly came into sharp focus. Douglas Lemming was the killer they had been searching for. As the team prepared their case, another detail surfaced that tightened the net even further. Detectives spoke with Beatrice Langford, a neighbor who had known Douglas for years. She remembered with striking clarity that in 1980, he owned a dark-colored Chevrolet pickup truck from the mid-60s. The same kind of truck that Evelyn Albright had described in her terrified call on the night of the abduction. Most importantly, she recalled that the truck was missing its rear bumper. The witness description from 1980 and Beatrice's memory matched like puzzle pieces finally falling into place. With DNA evidence, eyewitness connection, and a 40-year-old truck description lining up perfectly. There was no room left for doubt. On December 12, 2023, officers moved in quietly but firmly. They approached Douglas at his home and placed him under arrest. He looked stunned, his eyes wide with disbelief, as if he never imagined that decades-old sins could return to confront him. He was escorted to the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office for questioning in the interrogation room. The detectives played a careful game. They did not mention the DNA immediately. Instead, they allowed Douglas to speak. At first, he denied everything. He claimed he had no idea who Karen was. He insisted he had lived a quiet life and had never harmed anyone. But as hours passed and questions tightened, cracks began to appear in his calm mask. Detective Sergeant Aaron Green leaned forward and spoke firmly, telling Douglas that witnesses had placed him near the area. Douglas swallowed hard and looked away. Moments later, he changed his story, admitting that he had been with Karen that night. He claimed they had consensual relations in the game area, trying to soften the truth with a lie that could not stand against scientific evidence. Then, in a desperate attempt to deflect blame, Douglas mentioned a name investigators had never heard before. Anthony Harris. He claimed Harris had been nearby in the woods and had followed Karen after Douglas left. His voice trembled slightly as he suggested that Harris must have been the one who killed her. It was a transparent attempt to shift the guilt. But the name itself was new and dangerous. For detectives, this changed everything. Someone else had been there. Someone who might have seen, known, or participated in Karen's abduction. And the fact that Douglas tried to use him as a shield suggested Harris played a far more disturbing role that had yet to be uncovered. A second figure had just stepped out of the shadows of this 44-year-old mystery, and he carried the missing pieces investigators needed to complete the truth. Once the name, Anthony Harris, escaped from Douglas Lemming's lips, detectives felt the air in the interrogation room shift. A second figure had been present that night. Someone who had remained hidden for more than 4 decades. Someone who might hold the missing truth that investigators had been chasing since 1980. Detectives immediately began searching records, old addresses, and past associations. It did not take long to find him. Anthony Harris was living in a worn-down apartment complex in Port Huron, a building with peeling paint and dim hallways that smelled of stale smoke. He was 63 years old, thin, jittery, and carried the tired posture of someone who had lived a hard and unstable life. When officers arrived at his door, he looked confused at first, then terrified when they spoke his name. He was placed under arrest and taken to the sheriff's office for questioning. Inside the interrogation room, Anthony could not sit still. His leg bounced uncontrollably. His hands twisted together. His eyes flicked nervously from one detective to another. He kept insisting he knew nothing, had done nothing, and had no connection to any girl named Karen. The more he talked, the more panicked he sounded. His voice trembled, growing higher each time he denied involvement. Detectives watched him carefully, waiting for the moment his fear would reveal the truth. Detective Sergeant Aaron Green leaned forward and delivered the blow they had prepared. He told Anthony that the DNA from the crime scene had been matched to him. He told him the evidence had been sitting there for decades, waiting to expose him. The room fell silent. The bluff hung in the air like a heavy fog. Anthony froze. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His eyes widened with horror. Every bit of color drained from his face. He believed it. After a long shaking breath, Anthony lowered his head into his hands. His shoulders trembled as the weight of 4 decades finally cracked through his lies. His voice broke as he whispered that he could not take it anymore. And then the truth began to pour out. Anthony confessed that on the night Karen disappeared, he had been with Douglas. They had been cruising in the dark-colored Chevrolet truck, drinking beer and wandering the quiet streets. When they saw Karen alone in her Buick after Frederick had walked away, Douglas slowed the truck. His mood changed. His eyes fixated on her. Before Anthony could fully understand what was happening, Douglas stepped out with a gun and forced Karen into the truck. Anthony admitted he helped hold her down in fear and confusion. Terrified of Douglas and too cowardly to stop him, he described the drive out to the Beards Hills State Game area. The heavy silence in the truck, the cold night air pressing through the gaps in the doors, and Karen's shaking breaths in the darkness. When they reached the isolated spot among the pine trees, Douglas ordered Anthony to stay by the truck. Anthony did as he was told. He claimed he stood there frozen, clutching the edge of the truck bed while Karen was led away into the woods. Moments later, 2 gunshots echoed through the trees. Anthony flinched as he repeated the memory, his voice cracking with the weight of it. The details matched the old evidence perfectly. Evelyn Albright's terrified call about a woman forced into a truck at gunpoint. The 2 shots. The description of the vehicle. The timeline. The location. Everything connected. Anthony cried softly as he admitted that he had stayed silent all these years, living with the memory like a shadow that never loosened its grip. But now he wanted to tell everything. He agreed to cooperate fully with investigators and to testify against Douglas Lamming. He accepted a plea agreement, choosing truth at last over fear, and with his confession. The final pieces of Karen's last night finally aligned, revealing a story that had been lost in darkness for almost 44 years. The courtroom in St. Clair County filled slowly on an October morning in 2024. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that settles only when a community has waited decades for justice. For the first time since 1980, the truth behind Karen Marie Humphrey's final hours was about to be laid bare before a jury. Detectives, reporters, retired officers who once worked the case, members of the Humphrey family all gathered with quiet, fragile hope. At the center of it all sat Douglas Lamming, older now, his face stiff and unreadable, as if trying to mask the knowledge that the past had finally caught him. The prosecution began with precision. District Attorney Michael Wendling stepped forward and presented the backbone of the case. The DNA profile extracted from Karen's autopsy, preserved through time and revived by modern technology. The jury watched as enlarged charts showed the unmistakable genetic match between the old evidence and the water bottle. Douglas discarded. Wendling explained how forensic genealogy narrowed the suspect pool to the Lamming family, how surveillance confirmed Douglas as the closest match, and how the laboratory provided near absolute certainty. Then came the testimonies. Dr. Miles Corbin from Outram explained how the degraded biological sample was transformed into a complete genome. Carla Davis from the genealogy team described the painstaking process that traced distant relatives and guided investigators to Douglas. And the neighbor, Beatrice Langford, took the stand to recall the dark Chevrolet pickup Douglas once owned, the same truck missing its bumper, the same truck Evelyn Albright had described during her frightened call in 1980. Her voice trembled slightly, but her memory remained sharp as she pointed at Douglas seated just a few feet away. But the courtroom shifted when Anthony Harris entered. He walked slowly to the witness stand, his shoulders tense, his eyes downcast. The room held its breath as he began to describe the night that had haunted him for over 4 decades. He spoke of cruising with Douglas, of stopping when they spotted Karen alone beside her Buick, of Douglas lifting a gun and forcing Karen into the truck while Harris, terrified, helped restrain her. He described the silent ride to the game area, the cold air, the dark trees. He repeated Douglas's order for him to stay at the truck. Then he spoke of the 2 gunshots, sharp, final, echoing through the woods. He admitted he did not see the trigger pulled, but he knew what had happened. He knew Douglas returned alone. His voice cracked as he said the words. The jury listened in absolute silence. The defense fought back hard. Attorney Warren Doyle argued that Douglas had already admitted to having consensual relations with Karen, presenting it as the reason for the DNA match. He pressed the idea that Anthony Harris was unreliable, a desperate man seeking leniency by shifting blame. Doyle challenged the consistency of Evelyn Albright's long-past description, pointing out she reported seeing one man forcing Karen into a truck, while Harris described two abductors. His voice rose as he tried to plant doubt, repeating that nobody had seen Douglas pull the trigger, but the prosecution reminded the jury that science did not waver. DNA did not lie. And every essential detail Harris provided aligned with the evidence collected in 1980. The mismatched details, they explained, reflected the chaos of that night, not innocence. When the jury retired to deliberate, the entire courtroom sank into heavy silence. Sylvia Humphrey, now elderly but unbroken, held her daughter Lisa's hand and stared straight ahead. It had taken 44 years to get here. The weight of it pressed into every person present. The jury returned sooner than anyone expected. Faces solemn, steps slow. The four women stood and read the verdict with steady clarity. Guilty of first-degree murder. A sound rose through the gallery, not applause, not shouting, but a long breath released by dozens of people at once. A breath held for decades. Sylvia's tears flowed quietly as she placed her hand over her heart. Judge Cynthia Lane delivered the final blow with calm authority. Douglas LeMang was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The gavel struck firm and final, sealing the fate of a man who had evaded justice for most of his life. Yet even with the verdict delivered, one more emotional truth remained waiting in the story, a truth that showed how justice, even when found, can never truly erase the scars left behind. When the courtroom emptied and the echoes of the verdict faded, a different kind of silence settled over St. Clair County. It was not the silence of confusion or fear that had haunted the community for decades. It was the silence that arrives when truth finally rises from darkness after being buried for almost half a lifetime. A silence heavy with emotion, yet softened by relief. Sylvia Humphrey stepped out of the courthouse slowly, leaning on Lisa's arm for support. She looked up at the cold sky, her breath trembling as it left her chest. For 44 years she had carried a weight no mother should bear. The uncertainty, the sleepless nights, the torment of believing the wrong man had taken her daughter, the endless hope that someday the real truth would surface. Now, standing in the chilly Michigan air, she whispered her daughter's name with a fragile peace that had never been possible before. Lisa and the rest of the Humphrey family surrounded her gently. They knew that nothing would bring Karen back. They knew that justice, when delayed this long, could never erase the ache. But they also knew that Karen's story finally had an ending grounded in truth rather than confusion. And that mattered. It mattered more than words could hold. Elsewhere, Anthony Harris received his own sentencing. Because he had confessed fully, cooperated, and revealed the entire truth, he received a reduced sentence for his role as an accomplice. 15 years in prison. As he was led away, he kept his head bowed. His face carried the look of a man who had been living under a shadow for decades. A shadow he had helped create. He would live with the memories and the guilt for the rest of his life. And he knew it. For Detective Sergeant Aaron Green, the closing of this case was unlike anything he had ever experienced. After the verdict, he stepped outside the courthouse and paused for a long moment, staring across the quiet street. He thought of the detectives who had worked this case before him, men who had grown old without answers. He thought of the mistakes made, the wrongful conviction of Calvin Hayes, and the years lost to confusion. And he thought of Karen, a young woman frozen forever at 21, whose final moments had been lost in darkness, until science reached far enough to uncover them. Detective Green pulled out his notebook and wrote a single sentence before closing it gently. Case resolved. Justice delivered. After 44 years, he exhaled slowly, feeling both the weight of the past and the rare satisfaction of a story brought fully to light. The file of Karen Marie Humphrey, once buried in dust, was finally closed. Not forgotten. Never forgotten, but complete at last. It would rest in the archives not as an unsolved mystery, but as a testament to perseverance, evolving science, and the quiet power of truth. And now, as we reach the end of this long and emotional journey, I want to speak directly to you. Because if you are still watching this story till this final moment, it means this story touched you. It means you traveled through the cold Michigan nights, through years of silence, through heartbreak, and through the final rise of justice with us. And that means this story truly deserves your like and your subscribe. Please turn on the bell icon so you never miss more real-life stories from Unscripted Tales, and help me reach 5,000 likes on this story. This is the target my mother asked me to achieve, so help me, family. It is completely free, and it supports us more than you know. And before you go, tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story. I will be waiting to read your city name.